Welcome, my name is Peter Curtie, and it's a great pleasure for me to be your host for this evening's conversation about cures and consequences. How does government navigate the science? Well, these days we tend to invest scientists with a degree of authority that elevates them almost to the status of infallibility. But scientists aren't infallible, and they shouldn't override disagreements that arise between elected politicians. By the same token, neither are scientists unscrupulous fraudsters who have their own hidden political agendas. The truth surely lies somewhere between the two. Science is a flawed and all too human affair, but it can generate timeless truths as well as reliable, practical guidance in a way that other approaches cannot. Matt Ridley is one of Britain's best-known science writers, internationally well-known science writer. A zoologist by training, he began his career at The Economist and has been a regular columnist in leading newspapers both in the UK and the US. He is the best-selling author of a number of books, most recently Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, which he co-authored with the genetic engineering expert Alina Chan. As Viscount Ridley, a title he inherited in 2012, Matt was a Conservative hereditary peer from 2013 with an elected seat in the House of Lords, which he held until 2021, when he retired from the Lords to do more useful things, he says. Well, Matt's an old friend of the CIS, and we're delighted he's now made a return visit to us. So will you now please welcome Matt Ridley back to the Centre for Independent Studies. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter, very much indeed, and very good to be back at the CIS. Great to be back in Australia. Sorry I brought the British weather with me. What I want to do tonight, as Peter said, is talk about science, but also technology and progress, and whether or not we're going to be able to capture the good and escape the bad of what's happening in the world today. Richard Feynman once said that science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, which is a cheeky way of saying that it's the evidence, not the expertise, that counts when you're looking at some evidence. I'm a rational optimist. That's the title of one of my books. But I'm more worried than I was when I wrote that book about the future of mankind. Not because I think the climate or something else is going to get us, but because I think a combination of culture warriors, crony capitalists, and corrupt scientists may prevent us capturing the benefits of progress that we know are available. And I used the word cure and consequence in the title of this talk because I'm concerned that we are, in some cases, adopting cures that are worse than diseases. We're trying to predict and prevent the next pandemic by causing a pandemic. I think that's what we've done as humanity in the last few years. I think we're trying to make the weather safe by making our energy system dependent on the weather. And I think we're trying to prevent the harms of innovation by preventing innovation. And I think that's potentially a mistake. Innovation, for me, is the main event. It's the best thing that happened in the last 200 years. It's the cause of the human betterment that we've seen. And it is extraordinary how much improvement there has been in human living standards. In my lifetime, the world has gone from more than half the world living in extreme poverty to less than 8% today. Nobody has ever lived through a transformation like that. The lifespan, the average lifespan of the average human being across the whole world has increased in my lifetime at the rate of 5 hours a day. That's quite an intriguing number, I think, to remind us that we have become wealthier, healthier, happier, cleverer, keener, cleaner, kinder, more peaceful, and more equal over the last 50 years or so. Most people don't believe we're getting more equal, but we are, because people in poor countries have been getting rich much faster than people in rich countries in recent decades. And even when innovation does bring risks with it, we have car crashes, we have computer viruses, etc. They are worth it. We don't think, oh gosh, I wish we'd never invented the motor car or we'd never invented the computer. And of course, the reason we can get the benefits but not the risks from innovation is because we can literally choose. We can make a choice as society to make sure that the good things spread and the bad things don't. On the whole, if you want to invent computer viruses, you have to work in secret and it's quite a struggle. Whereas if you want to invent antivirus software, you can work in the open and recruit more people. So it's always going to be the case that innovation is going to produce more good than harm on the whole. But innovation has always been opposed. People have often resisted innovations. Just under 200 years ago, the railway was in the process of being invented just down the road from where I lived. And there were vitriolic campaigns against this terrifying and dreadful new technology that was going to cause horses to abort their foals and things like that. The umbrella was strongly opposed by the drivers of hansom cabs in London. This appalling new thing that was going to poke out people's eyes and things like that. Well, they were a vested interest. They obviously didn't want it. My favourite example is coffee. When coffee came from Ethiopia to the Middle East and then to Europe in the 1500s and the 1600s, it was adamantly opposed, mostly by a combination of the wine and beer industries and others who didn't like this new competitor, so they bought and hired doctors to say that it was bad for you, but also by rulers. It was banned. Coffee was banned in many countries by the king, usually, on the grounds that people met in coffee houses and had gossips in coffee houses. And when they did so, they sometimes talked about whether the king was doing a good job. So Charles II in London was explicit. His reason for banning coffee houses was because coffee houses led to fake news. He pretty well used that term. Now, we are currently supposed to be very worried about artificial intelligence as an innovation. There was a big meeting in the UK just in the last 10 days about how to safely regulate AI. And I think we'll get this wrong. And why do I think that? I sat on the AI Select Committee in the House of Lords for a year, about 5 years ago. We produced, I thought, a very good report, but we didn't mention large language models in them because we didn't see them coming. And that was just a few years before they turned up. It's almost impossible to predict technology, and it's even harder to predict the harms and to get ahead of them and to say what we need to do to prevent them. I personally think that AI will augment rather than replace people. I think the evidence suggests it won't be, like all forms of automation, going back to the threshing machine, it basically encourages people to be more productive and more efficient rather than to displace them from the world altogether. But just to illustrate how difficult it is to predict the progress of technology, I want to give you 3 quick quotations. One is from Ken Olsen, the head of Digital Equipment Corporation in 1977, the company that was making the mini computer, the most successful computer company of the time. And he said in 1977 that there is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. And he was making the smallest computers out there. In 1998, Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, by 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will have been no greater than the fax machines. I sometimes, when I quote that, have to explain to young people what a fax machine is. And Steve Ballmer, the head of Microsoft, in 2007, said there is no chance that the iPhone is going to get market share. No chance. So there are no experts on the future. That, I think, is true. I just think in complex dynamic systems like technology, like the economy, like a pandemic, like the weather, beyond a very short time horizon, you can't make interesting predictions about the future. And the whole science of modeling, which we saw becoming very dominant during the pandemic, is, I think, snake oil. I think it's either telling you something with a very wide margin of error that is useless, or it's wrong, and it can't get closer than that. There's a very good book written by Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, and John Kay recently, called Radical Uncertainty. And what they argue is that it's a big mistake to take chunks of the future and call them puzzles that if only we had a bigger computer we could solve. Because there are things that are not puzzles, they are genuine mysteries. They are not something we can reduce the uncertainty around. And therein lies some serious mistakes. But doom-mongering about the future is big business. If you want to make a lot more money than I do from my books, then you should write a book called The Rational Pessimist, about how it's all going to hell in a handcart. And part of my motivation for becoming an optimist was realizing that all my worries when I was young were wrong. The population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, the pollution was going to shorten human lifespan, the acid rain, the ozone layer, sperm counts, the ice age, the stuff we were told in the 70s was really, really gloomy, and I believed it. And it was quite a shock to me to wake up a decade or two later and think, hang on, the world's getting better, not worse. So I'm on a bit of a campaign to try and tell young people that you shouldn't necessarily believe all these mongers of doom. And of course the big one was global warming, which is the gift that has kept on giving for doom mongers for 40 years now. And it keeps on giving because we can't give up fossil fuels. It turns out to be very difficult to run a modern economy without them. But you can always say that the real catastrophe lies in the future, even as droughts, floods and storms don't get worse, and on the whole they haven't, with some very small exceptions. But I tried a few years ago pointing out that actually extra carbon dioxide in the air, increasing the amount of CO2 in the air from 0.03% to 0.04%, hasn't had much effect on droughts, floods and storms, but it has had a big effect on plants. We are seeing global greening on a spectacular scale. The calculation that the satellite team have come up with is that we now have an extra quantity of green vegetation on the planet every summer, equivalent to 2 continents the size of America after 30 years of global greening. But could I get anyone to pick this story up, or to do so without adding the rider, but it might come to an end, or but there's a downside? So the but there's a downside is the sort of absolute golden rule of journalism. And I find when I write optimistic articles, editors will often say to me, but surely you've got to put in something about how there's a downside. And I would say, well, when someone writes a gloomy article, do you say, but surely you should put in something about there being an upside? And there's an asymmetry there that we don't talk about. For me, the most worrying episode of opposition to innovation on the basis of doom-mongering is the genetically modified crops in Europe, the resistance of a whole continent to a whole technology. For 20 years now, still no GMOs being grown in Europe, with some very minor exceptions. And that's now very clearly a technology that is both extremely safe and extremely beneficial, both economically and environmentally. And yet we managed as a continent to resist, to reject an entire technology. And that was a harbinger of what, a suggestion that it just might be possible for the world as a whole to turn its back on innovations in the way that the Ming Empire turned its back on technology and innovation in a previous period, or the Ottoman Empire, or the Arab world after their Enlightenment and so on. Is it possible, I asked myself, that the whole world could say in the 21st century, no, we don't want innovation anymore, it's too dangerous, we have to try and find a way of living without it? And I hope not, But I do worry I worry more than I used to that is possible. Then along came a pandemic, and I, along with others, began to look into it. And at first I believed the scientists colleagues in Parliament said to me, "You know a bit about biology. Is it true that this thing came out of a lab in China?" And I said, no, it didn't. There's a paper called Proximal Origin of COVID-19, which has been published in Nature Medicine. It was in March 2020, and that's ruled it out. And I read the paper sketchily, and I then went back and read it, and thought, well, actually, it's not that convincing. It doesn't really nail it down. And then I came across a paper by this brilliant young woman, Alina Chan, saying this virus is extremely well adapted to human beings from the start. That's very odd, and it implies it's been in human beings somewhere, or in human cells at least, for quite a long time. And that same week, the head of the Centers for Disease Control, George Gao in China, came out and said it didn't start in the market. We've looked and we can't find any infected animals or infected people in the market. So I began to get more interested in the possibility of the lab leak, and I then discovered that, basically this disease had turned up in the only city that was doing experiments on SARS-like beta coronaviruses, in the only years when those experiments were being done. And it had a feature in it, which was the feature that they'd been putting into viruses, a thing called a furin cleavage site, and which they had actually planned to put into this virus, or into viruses like this. So as my co-author eventually put it, it's as if you've had leaked to you, and this leak came in September 2021, I think, called the defuse proposal. You found a leak that scientists have a plan for putting a horn on a horse. And a year and a half later, a unicorn turns up in that same city where that plan was drawn up. It's that surprising. So I think the evidence is fairly overwhelming that it's highly probable that this thing did start with a lab leak. And so it's worth asking, why were they doing those experiments? Because surely that's a form of innovation, and I'm in favour of innovation, aren't I? Well, actually, I don't think in the market anyone would ever do those experiments, because the justification for them was to prevent and predict the next pandemic. But it was a very threadbare justification. The idea, if we go and collect lots of viruses out of bats, and then we mix and match them, and then we juice them up a bit so that they can grow in human cells in the lab, then we might be able to tell how dangerous they are. Just think that through for a second. I mean, it's like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. Only governments are going to fund that kind of work. No, the private sector is not going to fund that kind of work. And so here, after decades of saying innovation is on the whole a good thing, and you should stop opposing it, here at last is somewhere where Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and all these lot are going to agree with me that, we shouldn't have been doing this. But where are they? They're not interested in this topic. And the scientific establishment, which wants to warn me about the dangers of climate change, is closing ranks on this topic, saying, no, there's nothing to see here, we're not going to investigate. I wrote to the Royal Society and said, look, please, can we have a debate about this, about where this virus originated? And they said, no, it's too controversial a topic. What does that mean? And to this day, we are seeing conferences organised about the origins of pandemics and the next one, where it might come from, and they talk about things like deforestation, leading bats to take refuge in cities where they infect people. Right, yeah, so southern China is reforesting, not deforesting, at a rapid rate, more than almost anywhere on the planet. So the debate is sort of cast loose from reality here. And it's left me very disillusioned with the scientific establishment. And there are strong echoes with the way the scientific establishment reacted to certain scandals in climate science about 15 years ago. There's gatekeeping, there's using peer review or PAL review as a sort of way of closing ranks to keep out inconvenient conversations. There's a refusal to engage. Just today, there's a professor called Bryce Nichols at Rutgers University who has been leading a campaign to improve biosafety and understand more about how that paper, Proximal Origin, the one that deceived me, came to be written, because we now know from the emails of the authors and the Slack messages they sent to each other, which were uncovered by Congress, that they didn't believe their own paper, that all 5 of the authors were writing to each other saying, well, I'm afraid a lab leak is frigging likely. That's one of the words they used. And yet they wrote a paper saying the opposite. And they say, oh, well, we changed our minds. No, they didn't, because we've got their emails from a month after the paper was published, and they're still saying, yeah, I mean, it's still pretty likely, but you know, we'll stick to our view that it's not, because they wanted to make sure that there was no threat to the funding of virology. I think that was a big mistake. I think if science had said one small corner of virology has done some pretty stupid experiments, and even if it didn't cause this pandemic, we shouldn't do that again, then that would have been very good for the reputation of science, and the public would have come along. Instead of which, by saying, no, no, we can't talk about it, they're risking the whole of the scientific enterprise getting contaminated by this. And they are increasing things like vaccine hesitancy and all these other things that aren't necessarily justified. So, yeah, as I say, Bryce Nichols has been writing to Nature Medicine, which published that paper, saying we've got a large petition now that that paper should be retracted because we know the authors didn't believe their own conclusions. Will you please engage with us? And the editor refused to reply, and yesterday he blocked Bryce Nichols. He blocked a professor who's published in lots of papers like this. This is extraordinary behavior, and it's not the way that we should be conducting it in a free society. The other feature of that episode that I think is terribly interesting, and it again reminds me of some of the debates in climate science, is the importance of amateur sleuths. Back to Feynman's quote, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. There were non-experts who made enormous contributions here. Just as Steve McIntyre 15 years ago was the one who blew the whistle on the hockey stick graph, and when he looked into it, he thought this graph doesn't look right, and he was not a scientist, but he looked into it and eventually uncovered some very serious mistakes in the way the data had been handled, and certain data had been omitted and other had been included to make this graph mislead the public. So in this case, there was a young man in India called the Seeker who lived with his parents in a flat in Bhubaneswar, who was, as he put it to us, rather good at using the internet. And he got some logins and passwords for Chinese academic websites and downloaded a bunch of theses, which included some incredibly important information about the very closest relatives of what we later came to know as SARS-CoV-2, and where they'd collected them from southern China and brought them to Wuhan, and what experiments they'd done on them. And one of these theses was authored by a person who we now know was one of the first cases of SARS-CoV-2, etc. So the scientific establishment not interested in doing this investigation, but these amateurs doing so and pointing out that the emperor sometimes is naked. So my worry is that we're living in an era where cultural relativism, identity politics, groupthink, and crony capitalism, the degree of vested interest in opposing innovation, is going to prevent us having the incredible benefits that come from open scientific inquiry, freedom of speech, and technological progress in the decades to come. I hope I'm wrong. I hope in the next 20 minutes you can all put me right and reassure me and tell me I'm worried about nothing. But that's what I've come here to tell you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for those interesting and provocative remarks. Can I start with where you left off? Because some of your critics are still not convinced about the lab origin thesis, and they say that it's still highly possible that the virus was transmitted from animals, a zoonotic transmission. Are you still as firmly convinced in your own mind, or are you swayed by some of the critics now?
No, the other way around. I've become more and more... but even when we had published our book, we wouldn't put a number on it. We weren't sure, but neither of us were convinced either way. But we were leaning towards a lab leak being more likely. And our book is very open-ended. It actually... We have 2 chapters towards the end of the book. I drafted them. And the first one is basically addressing the jury and trying to persuade the jury that this thing did not come from a lab. And the second one is the opposite, trying to persuade it. Both of them are quite convincing chapters when you read them. But since then, the evidence has only got stronger for the lab leak. And the evidence is, and by that I mean things like more evidence about the lack of intermediate infected species in the market, the evidence for what experiments they were doing, and in particular, the absolute lack of collaboration of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in telling us what viruses they have. They accumulated a database of 22,000 entities, most of which were bat viruses, that they were studying. And it was only partially accessible to outsiders. Some of it was password protected. But they took it offline in September 2019, and it's never come back online. Now, the purpose of the database, and it says so in the preamble, was to help predict and prevent the next pandemic. Well, which pandemic are they waiting for before they share this database with us? It would exculpate them in a second if they were to say, look, here's the database. We weren't working on anything remotely similar to SARS-CoV-2. Get lost. But they won't do that. They won't share this database. And their excuse for not doing so is, well, you might hack it. What does that mean? If it's shared, you can't hack it. You know, it makes no sense. So it's far from rowing back from the lab leak. I've become more and more convinced that I'm afraid it is likely. And we know lab leaks happen all the time. You know, the original SARS-1, leaked 4 times from a lab, twice in Beijing and once in Taiwan and once in Singapore. Luckily, in each case, there were minor outbreaks and they were contained. But, you know, there are many examples of where if this virus had been in a lab, and similar ones were in the lab, we know that, then it's almost certain that people would have got infected.
So this does raise, if you're right, this raises important questions which you flagged about virological research. And indeed, concerns have been raised about so-called gain-of-function research, in which viruses are manipulated in the lab to become more dangerous. What kind of biosecurity regulations do you think governments need to put in place to guard against or to mitigate future risks, given that your earlier warning about experts trying to predict the future?
Exactly.
What does government need to do? Because it seems that government will need to do something.
Well, I'm a bit of a libertarian. I think regulation is often stifles innovation, can be a barrier to entry. We often get it wrong. But I'm nothing compared with these virologists when they talk about, you know, how dare you intrude on our space? We know what we're doing. Don't you dare bring in new regulations on us. You know, I'm not that much of a libertarian like they are. They don't think of themselves as libertarians, but on this they are. They're strongly resisting any kind of intervention. And you know, whereas if I'm doing chemistry experiments or something like that, I'm putting myself at risk and maybe my neighbors. With a virus, you're putting the world at risk if you get it wrong. And so I think there is a very strong case for some strong regulation. Now, banning all gain-of-function experiments would be a disaster. When you add vitamin A precursors to rice to make golden rice to save poor children from dying of vitamin A deficiency diseases, you're adding a gain of function. So to a plant in this case, not a virus. So there's 99% of gain of function experiments are safe, but there are very clear lines you can draw about when you're dealing with potentially pandemic pathogens. You should be able to have an internationally agreed standard about what experiments shouldn't be done, and if they are done, they should be done at biosafety level 4. The experiments that we know were done in Wuhan that did lead to much increased infectivity in bat SARS-like coronaviruses were done at biosafety level 2. Well, that's not much more than gloves and a mask.
Are we ready for the next pandemic, if there is to be another one?
I don't think we've learnt anything significant from the last one.
Right.
We've probably learnt the wrong lessons. That is to say, I suspect we will rush to lockdowns again, which I don't think. I think the evidence from Sweden suggests that voluntary measures to do social distancing work better than compulsory ones in terms of fewer downsides. But in terms of how to stop a virus at source when something goes wrong in either a market or a lab, we've done very little. We've done nothing to stop these kinds of experiments happening, but we've done nothing to stop wildlife markets, for example, which are a significant risk, as we know, because that's how the first SARS started, was in wildlife markets, as far as we can tell. Governments drawing up a treaty to say, we agree that we will not do the following things, and shaming other countries into signing them. China is very keen on international scientific collaboration, sending Chinese scientists to the West and so on. And if you said, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to accept any of your scientists until you sign this treaty, then I think you could reach a sensible position.
Because surely the problem is that in the last pandemic we were told to follow the science, and we were, the scientists and chief medical officers, certainly in this country, repeatedly told us to follow the science, and politicians said that they were following the best medical advice. We were told how to live, we were told how not to live, we were told that masks were safe, and we were told that vaccines were safe. And people, certainly in this country, any questions that were raised about the safety of vaccines, anyone who raised such questions found themselves denounced very quickly. And yet now, in the UK, just today, reports of a test case having been launched in the High Court against AstraZeneca, arguing that the vaccines were not adequately tested and were not safe, and that the AstraZeneca vaccine has given rise to a new condition. I'll pronounce it: vaccine-induced immune thrombosis with thrombocytopenia.
Yes, particularly in younger people, I think. I think it's, at least the suggestion is the risk-benefit may have been wrong in younger people. Forcing these vaccines on children who are at very low risk from COVID-19 seems to me wrong. I several times told the UK government, please don't go out there and say this vaccine is 100% safe, because no vaccine is 100% safe. There are, there's no such thing as zero risk. But what you need to say is that if you're elderly, the risk of the disease is greater than the risk of the vaccine. And I still believe that. And it would be a terrible shame if after this pandemic we give up on all vaccines, because they have been incredible lifesavers. From smallpox, from polio, all these other diseases that we've eradicated with vaccines. But we overpromised with these vaccines. I've had COVID twice. Both my episodes were after all 3 of my vaccines. So the idea that they were going to stop me getting it is nonsense. But that's what we were told by people like Anthony Fauci early on. That and the claims about masks, where again the evidence is there is zero good evidence that masks did any good. The claims about aerial transmission, scientists saying, no, it's not transmitted aerially, it's going to be on surfaces. We now know that was 100% wrong, etc. So the overconfidence of scientists was a huge mistake which will backfire on science as a whole. And the very phrase, you used it, the science, should never be heard in public. There is no such thing as the science. Science is a debate.
And it's never settled.
It's never settled, and there's always evidence both ways.
So there's something of a crisis in scientific inquiry at the moment, and you've talked about this in a number of your articles. You've spoken about the problem of replication bias. Is there... where do you see this crisis, or how do you see this crisis in science resolving itself? You referred to these well-informed, internet-savvy amateurs, sleuths. Do you think we're already reverting to an age of what we might call citizen science in order to harness the collective knowledge of society? How do we restore the integrity of science and scientific inquiry?
Citizen science has a good tradition, actually. There's lots of science areas where amateurs have made contributions. But at the same time, of course, if you start to believe anyone and everything and don't use evidence base, as somebody once put it, if you're too open-minded, your brains fall out. And so getting that balance right is very difficult. I personally think that science as a philosophy is in great shape. There's nothing wrong with the idea that experiment and logic can get you to fascinating new insights about the world. But science as an institution is almost as bad as the Catholic Church before Luther. It needs a reformation. It has become very much self-reinforcing. It brooks very little outside criticism. Scientific journalists are not like political journalists or business journalists or sports journalists who criticize their subjects, their people, and challenge them. Scientific journalists see their job as defending and championing the science. They're just communicators, as it were. And I think that's wrong. I think we need a profession called science critics, just as we are art critics or film critics or whatever, who say, no, actually, this is a bad bit of science. It shouldn't have been done, either morally or it's inadequately done. So much more of an open conversation, much more challenge. If you think about someone like Anthony Fauci, he was the highest paid American public servant by the time he retired. He'd been in the job for over 30 years, the same job for over 30 years. He had power over an enormous empire of funding. He was not accountable because of a decision George W. Bush took in the aftermath of the anthrax attacks. He was basically put in charge of the bioweapons and bioterror defense network and was to some extent beyond democratic challenge. That can't be right. That isn't the way that we need to conduct science. There needs to be multiple different funding sources, relatively short terms for people in these top jobs, etc., etc.
And yet there is a place for government to intervene at some point, or to control for bad actors, particularly in virology. It's not a space that government can vacate completely, surely.
Correct. And I've never been enough of a libertarian to say that we don't need air traffic control, we don't need traffic lights or something like that. Of course there are ways to do it, but I do come back to this point that I think the private sector would never have done those experiments. And I think that's worth reflecting on, because A, there wouldn't have been enough upside for them, but B, there was too much downside. you know, that there is a degree to which, when government is funding science, it doesn't have to worry about the risks so much. And so I do think that while government must regulate, we need to think carefully about the incentives for scientists to do irresponsible experiments.
Given this relationship, an emerging or an important role for government, but government mustn't be too heavy-handed, because in some of the examples that you cited, governments and those in authority sought to stifle innovation. I just wanted to picking up a point you made at the outset. What's the difference between invention and innovation? Is it that between Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, and Steve Jobs, who developed the iPhone? Is that the difference?
Yes-ish. I personally, I mean, I made this distinction in my book, How Innovation Works, which I think is important. You can invent a new device, but you've then got to make it affordable, available, and reliable. And a lot of the great innovators actually didn't invent things, they just made them affordable, available, and reliable. People like Thomas Edison, he didn't invent the light bulb, but he sure made it accessible to people. And he did a huge amount of work in doing so. So he tested 6,000 different types of plant material before he settled on a particular kind of Japanese bamboo for the filament of his first light bulb. Someone like Jeff Bezos did not invent e-commerce, but he sure brought it to us, as it were. And I think in our understanding of the world, we give prizes and patents to inventors, but we don't pay enough attention to the importance of innovators, of people who actually translate these new devices into availability to all of us. And that's often a harder task than inventing it in the first place.
And you warned against, and to use your phrase, bossy governments, excessive regulation, and powerful firms who remain the enemies of innovation. How important are markets still to you? I mean, your optimism has been, if not dulled, perhaps tamed, as you said at the outset. What is the place for markets in and the free exchange, commercial exchange in the development of, well, in innovation?
I think markets are terribly important. The market tests whether an innovation is any good. Take Google Glass, for example. You remember they invented this thing whereby you could sort of, on the inside of your spectacles, you could see the latest stock market or whatever it was. And it was a brilliant invention, but at $250, nobody wanted to buy a pair of nerdy glasses with the internet on it. And it was a complete commercial flop. And there are other examples of well, actually, just sitting in a television studio yesterday waiting to go on, there was somebody was advertising a sort of floppy mosquito screen over a door. And I was just sort of thinking, you know, I'd never seen that. It has sort of magnetic things, so it sort of closes, you push through and it just closes behind you. And so it's a really useful, nice new idea. That's somebody going out there and, you know, somebody going to the trouble of thinking something through and coming up with a new device and then they're out there on television trying to persuade people to buy it, and they might fail. You know, it might be a completely useless thing, I don't know, but it might be very good. But, you know, that's the test in the end, is whether people want it.
Let's go to questions from the audience. Do we have any questions for Matt?
You haven't said much about community awareness and literacy in science, and it seems to be a streaming of people, even from school age and so on. There are all these normal people, and then there are the scientists who are a strange race, slightly mad with tousled hair and so on. If there was much better general understanding of how science works and scientists are normal people, I suspect a lot of the abuses and the things you're talking about, the community wouldn't have tolerated it, and journalists wouldn't have had to pick it up, and the politicians wouldn't have been bamboozled by it.
Yeah, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but very few British politicians have science degrees. let alone advanced ones, and they are easily bamboozled, as you say. I think this is a particular problem with respect to the handling of statistics. You see that again and again, that politicians, journalists, and the members of the public make elementary mistakes or misunderstandings about statistics. And I mean, I'm not great at numbers myself, but I've worked hard at it, and I've tried to make sure I don't make mistakes of that kind. And yes, basic scientific literacy is tremendously important. In the UK, you can say things like, "Oh, I never did science after O level," and sort of proud of it. Whereas Americans aren't like that. Americans wouldn't want to admit that they'd given up science early in their school career, etc. So we need to make it as shaming's the wrong word, but to be a scientific Philistine is not embarrassing. To be an artistic one is embarrassing. To say, "Oh, I've never heard of Charles Dickens" or something, you wouldn't admit to that. Well, to say I've never heard of the second law of thermodynamics should be just as embarrassing.
Question from Peter here, Peter Crossing.
You just brought up America a couple of times, and would you like to comment on the involvement of investment from Americans in the Wuhan lab, and the impact that may have had on the commentary that came out of it?
Yeah. The US, through an organization called the EcoHealth Alliance, was funding research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The US government was. The EcoHealth Alliance is a non-profit run by Peter Daszak, and its biggest partner, the research that it was proudest of, was the Xi Zhengli's lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So there is no doubt that money flowed from the US taxpayer to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It wasn't their only source of funding. They got a lot of money from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, obviously, and other sources as well. And the key document, the defuse proposal, which was the proposal to put a furin cleavage site into a SARS-like coronavirus for the first time, was EcoHealth Alliance's application to DARPA, part of the Pentagon, for money, and was turned down by the Pentagon. So that some say, well, therefore it can't have happened. But actually, if you read the proposal, it reads like experiments they've started doing already and just want to get some funding for, which is a common practice in science and is not necessarily illegitimate. And anyway, as I say, the Chinese Academy of Sciences was funding it anyway, and they probably said, well, that experiment, which was going to happen in North Carolina, we could do that here. Now, if they're not going to fund it there, we'll do that here. So the collaboration there. Now, Anthony Fauci said furiously and patronizingly to Senator Rand Paul again and again, we did not fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan. And you don't know what you're talking about, Senator, and all that kind of thing. Well, for a long time there was an email that they wouldn't unredact, as it were, and eventually they unredacted some of it, and eventually we saw the whole email, and it says, but in terms, not quite these terms, but roughly these terms, "Dear Dr. Fauci, thanks for funding our gain-of-function research here in Wuhan." I've exaggerated a little bit, but it does have the phrase in it. So he had a very, very threadbare justification for saying that we don't fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan, because there was one definition of gain-of-function research of concern, which was that it was done on human viruses. Well, these were bat viruses at the time. They were turning them into human viruses. So that's a pretty poor defense of it. But that is partly why the US is where we're going to find out what was going on, because as part of their work, EcoHealth Alliance was getting reports back from Wuhan. So that's why we know more than we would otherwise know. But it's China where this work was happening. And there's a slight tendency in the American media, etc., to focus on Fauci and America and what was said by whom. We need to, you know, if this had happened in any other country, we'd be putting enormous pressure on Brazil or Russia or wherever it might be to come clean about what exactly the experiments they were doing.
Thank you. This gentleman in the brown shirt.
How can you really solve the problem where an Indian living in a village that I can't pronounce or find on a map can show all the malfeasance that was hidden by everyone during these last few years? I mean, it is a big problem if that's the person you quote as a source of... It really is, isn't it? Surely. It's a big problem.
Well, do you mean it's a problem that the professionals didn't bother to look into it, and it was left to Jeet Ray, is his real name. He's happy to have his anonymity removed at this stage. And there was another brilliant guy called Francisco Ribeiro, who's a Spaniard who lost his job at the beginning of the pandemic. He lives in Madrid, and he was used to auditing, so he began to investigate which trips those scientists had made to which bat caves on which dates, and he was able to piece together from little clues exactly which samples had come from which caves and been collected on which dates, and he ended up saying they've got 1,300 viruses from that cave, 1,320. The true number turned out to be 1,322 when they admitted it, so he wasn't far off. And he then said they've synthesized, they've grown in the lab live viruses, 16 of them, WIV1, WIV2, etc., up to WIV16. And Francisco then said, well, we know what all of them are except WIV15. We still don't know what that one was. Please, will you tell us what WIV15 was? And they won't. Now, you know, Francisco doesn't have a science degree. Jeet Ray doesn't have a science degree. It's a scandal that, you know, Britain is full of brilliant biomedical scientists, great big things like the Wellcome Trust and so on, and none of them were investigating.
That's exactly
this.
what I'm, so what's the, how can this be? This is a big problem, surely.
It is, I agree.
And then finally, are you allowed to make a comment on the British inquiry into the COVID lockdown files and everything, or?
Yes, I think we're having an appalling COVID inquiry in the UK. It's gone on for months already. It's cost an absolute fortune. It's a judge and a lawyer telling each other how clever they are, who don't understand science, aren't interested in science. What they want to know is how many four-letter words Boris Johnson and his advisors used to each other in their WhatsApp messages, which was a lot, by the way.
Thanks. Gentleman here in the middle.
Matt, let's just go back to climate matter.
Yep.
Australia's contribution to global emission equivalent is around 1.28% at the moment. But the biggest culprit, as we all know, is China at 30%. And if for China to reduce by just 1%, if we can convince them to reduce by just 1%, it's a far greater impact than Australia to get to net zero. You would agree?
Yes.
Imagine you have an audience of 20-somethings in front of you. How do you explain that to these young people, the social economic, you know, ramification if we were to try to get to net zero? Why don't we just go after China? I mean, look at those Just Stop Oils in London. Why don't we get them to protest in Beijing, see what happens?
I completely agree with you. Now, the real response, of course, is we wouldn't be allowed to protest in Beijing. But what they will often also say is, but Beijing is a leader in renewable technologies. Well, damn right it is. It's selling us all the tools, the wind farms and so on. And then they will also say, yes, but China is still getting rich. We've got rich, so we've had these hundreds of years of emitting carbon dioxide, etc. But I mean, I can't remember his name, but there's a TV presenter here in Australia who did this brilliant thing on live TV, I think on Your Question Time, whatever it's called, where he turned to a politician and said, remind me, what is the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Peter?
Oh, you're asking me?
I'm pretending I'm him.
Oh,
and
right,
asking
and he
you,
didn't know.
and they didn't know, exactly. And of course it's 0.03%. Now,
on
300
the
parts
spot
per
there,
million
right.
sounds like a lot, but 0.03% sounds like a very small amount. So increasing carbon dioxide from 0.03% to 0.04% is what we've done so far. 93% of this carbon dioxide that enters the atmosphere every year is natural. It comes from plants and animals and the ocean and so on. Only about 5 or 6% comes from fossil fuels and people and so on. 1% of that is from Australia. When people say, but we've had an enormous effect on the atmosphere, you say, well, hang on, you've had a very small effect on the atmosphere. That small effect can have an effect on the climate. Nobody's denying that. But it isn't automatically. So I think getting people to understand the numbers is a helpful thing to do.
Question here for Kevin.
Yeah, hi. You were mentioning earlier the difficulty you had dealing with media to get them to write the positive story without the but. And I guess one thing that we all see a lot is tribalism in media, a very blinkered approach, and not really wanting to do the job of media, which is to go and actually find out what's really happening. Any thoughts on how do we turn that around? Because it's a bizarre situation, truly bizarre.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two reasons why journalism doesn't do investigative reporting to the extent that it used to, and is not as dispassionate. One is because Google ate their lunch. The old media lost all their income from advertising budgets, and so they had to find other ways of doing things, and they're running on threadbare budgets, and they just haven't got the bandwidth to do the stuff. And you see, certainly certain UK newspapers now have reporting that is sponsored by the Gates Foundation or something like that. Well, that's not independent reporting. But the other reason came home to me when I was at an event in California very soon after Trump got elected, and I was sitting next to a television producer who said, this is such a disaster, the election of Trump, that we have got to rethink the way we do journalism. We've got to educate people. We've got to stop informing people and start educating them. So I think there was a pretty conscious decision, certainly in the US and partly in the rest of the world, to move away from dispassionate, objective journalism and to effectively a form of indoctrination instead, on certain topics in particular. Now, how do we undo that? By supporting independent channels on social media and elsewhere. And, people like Jordan Peterson and others are way bigger brands now than a lot of mainstream media brands. And so I'm quite hopeful that it will be hard for the legacy mainstream media to maintain a grip on these channels of information.
Question from over here.
Yeah, thank you. Isn't that problem of journalists redefining what they believe their role part of a broader concern, perhaps that we're seeing with science, and that I think were alluding to earlier, kind of a perhaps linked to postmodernism and perhaps linked to the convergence of crony capitalism, that vested interests are operating in a different way, perhaps, than they have in the past?
I tend to reassure myself that things were pretty bad in the past too. I think there was a golden age, certainly for journalism, in the sort of mid-20th century when it was really quite objective and investigative. But if you go further back, there's all sorts of corrupt practices and other things going on. So I don't think one mustn't golden age this stuff too much. Well, I just did, but you get the point. Yet, I mean, on the crony capitalism point, on the degree to which big business puts up barriers to entry through regulatory capture in government and so on, there's been some horrific episodes of that in the past, in various decades, etc. We've moved away from it at times. I think it's bad at the moment, but it's not necessarily that much worse than it's been at times in the past. Come back on that.
To your point on that, you mentioned before that private enterprise wouldn't have had a motive to create a pandemic. Given the incalculable wealth handed to them risk-free, in effect, by government during the pandemic, surely now there's a potential that they themselves could be looking forward to the next virus.
Well, I think you're not wrong that profiteering during the pandemic was something that certain capitalists enjoyed, and the pressure on governments to mandate vaccines for children, etc., was undoubtedly good for Pfizer and others, and we need to be alert to that. I'm more worried at the moment, by the way, about the bad actors, the really bad actors, the North Korean regime, the Iranian regime, ISIS, other organizations, and what lessons they're learning from the pandemic, because they will undoubtedly have looked at that and said, wow, that can bring the world economy to its knees in a flash, and it's quite cheap compared with nuclear weapons or whatever. Maybe we should be investing in some virology labs. Now, I'm sure that's happening, and I know from talking to people in the intelligence community that they're worried that's happening. So the proliferation risk of virology is almost the biggest risk of the lot that I'm worried about. And I just hope that our intelligence service, but this is another reason why, treaties on limiting this stuff, international treaties on limiting this, like we have with nuclear weapons, is vital. We don't even know. There isn't even a catalogue of the virology labs in the world. You don't have to register if you set up a biosafety level 2, 3 or 4 lab in the world. So there's no pressure on rogue governments not to develop this expertise, and that worries me.
Thank you. We have a question in the back.
Thank you very much for that presentation, by the way. It was surprisingly entertaining and amusing.
Surprisingly.
Exactly. I wanted to bring you back to CO2, if I may, and climate change.
Yes.
I have vacillated around the whole CO2 greenhouse, model. And I've tried to penetrate the IPCC reports. I mean, I've also read quite a bit of Ian Plimer. I don't know how much you've read of Ian Plimer.
I know it, yeah.
I mean, the way I read him is he thinks it's a complete furphy, the whole CO2 model. My question to you as a scientist is, are you convinced that CO2 does actually contribute to global warming?
Yes, on the whole I am. I actually... I went one further and challenged myself to convince myself that the increase in CO2 is the result of fossil fuels rather than something else that happens to be going on. Because I believe one should always challenge these kind of things. And after a series of conversations with Steve Koonin, I came away, and Nick Lewis, who two scientists I really trust on this, I came away convinced that yes, fossil fuels probably are responsible for the increase. That increase probably will, other things being equal, cause a warming. But I think the point that almost everybody doesn't get and has never had a chance to get is that we know exactly how much of a warming, other things being equal, that amount of extra CO2 should produce. But it's the other things being equal that's key, because all the models assume a then positive feedback, assume that there's a little bit of warming from carbon dioxide, which leads to more water vapor in the air, which leads to more warming. And it's that positive feedback that is deeply uncertain, and for which I think the evidence is almost entirely lacking. Because I think the evidence suggests that if you do get a bit of warming and a bit more water vapor in the air, you also get more clouds. And clouds are, well, we're not sure what clouds do. They could either increase the warming or decrease it. But the evidence that that we're going to get extra feedback warming on top of the direct carbon dioxide effect itself is very poor indeed, in my view. And yet it's still assumed by all the climate sensitivity models are, in my view, all the ones that use in the latest IPCC report are exaggerating the warming, therefore. So for me, it's an exaggeration rather than a nothing happening thing. But the idea that it's the one control knob that tells us how to come out of an ice age has, in my view, been comprehensively debunked. The increase in carbon dioxide at the end of an ice age follows the warming, not precedes it. And that's because the warmer you make the oceans, the more they release carbon dioxide.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed for all you have stirred in us this evening, Matt. It's been great. But will you please join me in thanking Matt?
Thank you.
Thanks.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.